On an ordinary West London street, between shuttered shops and parked delivery vans, a criminal empire quietly breathed. No guarded entrances, no warning signs, just people going to work. Cash changing hands, engines starting, doors closing, the kind of scene nobody looks at twice, and that's what made it so powerful. While Britain focused on obvious threats, something far larger was operating calmly in plain sight.
What investigators would later uncover wasn't a gang hiding in alleyways or abandoned warehouses, but a tightly organized network embedded into everyday British life. Front businesses were registered legally, tax filings appeared routine, and transactions looked harmless on the surface. Yet behind that respectable exterior was a £70 million machine designed to move money, people, and profits across borders without attention. This was organized crime that understood modern Britain, its systems, its blind spots, and its trust in what looks familiar. The foundation of the network was cash, large amounts of it. Cash that flowed in from UK street crime, illicit trades, and illegal services. Instead of letting it pile up in one place, the gang built a circulation system. Funds were broken down, redistributed, and reassembled through layers of businesses that dealt almost exclusively in cash. Car washes, transport firms, small trading operations. None of these raised alarms on their own. Together, they formed a pipeline. What made the operation especially effective was discipline. This wasn't chaos pretending to be control, it was control pretending to be normality. Routines were strict, movements were planned. Individuals had narrow roles and limited information. Couriers didn't know source or destination. Business operators didn't ask questions. Everyone understood their task and stayed within its boundaries. The less people knew, the safer the system became. Vehicles played a central role, not just as transport, but as camouflage. Vans and cars moved constantly through familiar routes, blending into commercial traffic. Modifications were hidden, compartments were engineered, and loading often happened in places no one pays attention to. Industrial estates, quiet back roads, service car parks. Nothing appeared rushed, nothing looked unusual. That appearance of calm was intentional. At the center of this structure stood leadership that valued invisibility over intimidation. Decisions were rarely made in person. Instructions flowed through trusted intermediaries. Exposure was treated as the ultimate failure, not arrest or loss. The goal wasn't dominance over rivals, it was survival through obscurity. As long as operations looked boring, authorities would look elsewhere. Money laundering wasn't treated as a side function, it was the backbone of everything. Without clean-looking money, the entire enterprise would collapse. So resources were invested in making the laundering process efficient, repeatable, and adaptable. Cash runs became routine. Flights were frequent but unremarkable. Patterns were intentionally pushed just below visibility thresholds. Individually, movements meant nothing. Collectively, they powered the empire. What shocked investigators later was how long this network functioned without interruption. Not because it was small, but because it was quietly professional. The gang avoided internal conflict, excessive displays of wealth, and unnecessary growth. Expansion was controlled. New participants were tested. Risk was calculated. This wasn't recklessness, it was patience. The illusion of legitimacy extended to daily life. Members lived locally. Families knew only fragments. Properties used for coordination looked like normal homes. Storage areas doubled as garages and spare rooms. There were no dramatic headquarters, no symbols of power. The business thrived because it didn't look like a criminal one. Over time, the operation became part of the environment. Familiar faces, familiar vehicles, familiar routines. That familiarity itself became protection. When something becomes part of the background, it stops being questioned. And this network relied on that psychological blind spot. But systems built on repetition can't stay hidden forever. The same reliability that made the operation successful also created consistency. And consistency, when observed long enough, becomes visible. Small observations began to align. Travel frequencies, financial discrepancies, businesses that made plenty of money but never quite made sense. Authorities didn't rush. They watched, mapped, compared. The absence of obvious crime forced a slower approach, one that focused on patterns rather than incidents. Instead of looking for a single mistake, they watched for structure. And slowly, the outline emerged. What initially appeared to be unrelated businesses and individuals began to connect. Routes overlapped, timings matched, financial flows echoed each other. A network that believed it was invisible was in fact leaving a perfectly logical trail. One built not on chaos, but on order. The most dangerous thing about this gang wasn't aggression or threat, it was confidence. Confidence that normality was enough cover. Confidence that familiarity would protect them indefinitely. For years it did, but as investigators closed the gap, it became clear that hiding in plain sight only works until someone decides to truly look. And once that happens, even the quietest empire starts to make noise.
That noise grew louder when investigators realized the operation wasn't limited to money. What initially looked like a sophisticated laundering network revealed a darker extension, one that treated people as logistics problems rather than human lives. The same discipline used to move cash was being applied to move migrants across borders, hidden inside the everyday mechanics of transport and trade. For the gang, smuggling people wasn't framed as cruelty or risk, it was framed as supply and demand. Desperation created opportunity, and opportunity was monetized. Individuals fleeing conflict or hardship were promised entry, safety, a chance to rebuild. What they received instead was silence, confinement, and uncertainty. The network never needed to meet them more than once. After payment, people became cargo, something to transfer, conceal, and deliver. Vehicles once used for commercial deliveries were repurposed with chilling efficiency. Hidden spaces were designed not for comfort but capacity. Every inch mattered. The goal was to fit as many as possible without drawing attention. Stops were minimized. Routes were chosen for familiarity rather than safety. Time became an enemy, but exposure was worse. The priority was arrival without detection, not well-being. What made these operations harder to detect was how seamlessly they fit into normal traffic. Vans entered ports, crossed borders, and moved through cities exactly as thousands of others did every day. Drivers followed lawful speed limits, paperwork looked correct, logistics appeared routine. The methods relied on the assumption that no one expects organized crime to look boring. Internally, the gang kept distance from the human reality of what they were doing. Communication avoided reference to individuals. Numbers replaced names. Language stayed transactional. By abstracting people into units, the operation reduced moral friction. This wasn't seen as harm, it was seen as business, and that mindset helped the network operate without internal breakdown. Payments were structured just like cash laundering. Deposits collected in stages. Transfers matched against overseas balances. Money rarely traveled alongside people. When someone was discovered, they were already disconnected financially from the people who had arranged their journey. That separation wasn't accidental. It was designed to limit accountability at every level. Front businesses again played a role. Transport companies provided cover. Warehousing explained vehicle movements. Legitimate routes justified repeated journeys. Even failures didn't immediately expose the structure because each attempt stood alone. One van, one driver, one trip. The larger system remained unseen. Investigators later described how difficult it was to connect these movements to a single network. Individually, incidents raised concern. Collectively, they revealed intent. Patterns emerged across borders, routes reused with precision, timing aligned with known cash flows. The crimes weren't spontaneous, they were scheduled. This wasn't opportunistic smuggling, it was industrial. The same network that moved money had realized it could move people using identical principles: compartmentalization, deniability, trusted intermediaries, and silence. Those organizing routes rarely met drivers. Drivers rarely knew coordinators, and those coordinating never directly interacted with the people being moved. What shocked authorities most wasn't sophistication, it was consistency. This wasn't a one-off operation gone wrong, it was repeated again and again. The structure remained stable because nothing about it relied on improvisation. Everything had been tested, refined, and repeated until it felt routine.
For migrants, routine meant uncertainty stretched across hours and days. They had no way of knowing where they were, who was responsible, or what would happen next. Communication stopped once movement began. The system didn't allow questions. Once inside the process, individuals had no agency. They were entirely dependent on a structure that never acknowledged them as people. The contrast between the normal world outside and the reality inside these operations became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Vehicles passed through motorways and service stations while carrying lives hidden from view. Commuters drove alongside them. None of it looked extraordinary, and that ordinariness became part of the crime itself. As authorities pieced this together, the narrative of the gang shifted. This was no longer just about profits and laundering. It became a case about exploitation embedded inside logistics, about how modern organized crime doesn't always rely on fear or force. Sometimes it relies on efficiency and indifference. The same discipline that protected the laundering network now became its weakness. Once investigators understood that money movements and people movements shared the same infrastructure, the picture sharpened. Two operations weren't running side by side, they were one system, monetizing everything it could move. And as attention intensified, pressure grew. Borders tightened. Surveillance increased. A network built to operate quietly now had to adapt under observation. Small adjustments were made. Routes altered. Timing shifted. But structure has limits. The more a system bends, the more visible it becomes. What had once blended perfectly into daily life was now being watched closely, and the empire that believed silence was protection was about to face scrutiny from a direction it could no longer ignore.
That scrutiny quickly revealed where the lifeblood of the empire truly flowed, not through violence or intimidation, but through cash. Vast amounts of it, unbanked, unrecorded, and constantly moving. The laundering operation was not a support function of the gang, it was the engine that powered everything else. Without that money pipeline, vehicles would stop moving, routes would collapse, and influence would evaporate overnight. What made the system so effective was how ordinary it appeared. Cash was collected in the UK from a range of criminal activity and broken into manageable amounts long before it ever left the country. No single transaction looked remarkable. No individual courier appeared suspicious. The operation relied on repetition, patience, and scale. Many small movements instead of a few large ones. International cash runs became routine. Flights to Dubai were especially useful, not because they attracted less attention, but because they attracted the right kind. Business travel, trading, tourism. The gang exploited that normality. Couriers traveled light, dressed unremarkably, and avoided patterns that could flag alarm systems. Some traveled repeatedly, others only once. Turnover was intentional. Familiarity breeds scrutiny. Front businesses played a critical role in justifying this movement. Trading firms, logistics companies, and small enterprises created paper explanations for cash flow. Invoices, receipts, and transaction logs formed a protective layer of legitimacy. To the outside world, it looked like international commerce. To the gang, it was a laundering corridor. What distinguished this network from less sophisticated groups was its understanding of thresholds. Amounts were carefully calculated to stay below automatic reporting limits. Timings were adjusted to avoid predictability. Even success was moderated. There was no rush to move everything at once. Money was allowed to rest, circulate, and re-enter the system gradually. Speed was less important than sustainability. Trips to Dubai became frequent enough to matter, but not enough to shock on their own. It was the cumulative picture that eventually stood out. Investigators noticed recurring travel by individuals with no commercial justification, routes repeated with quiet regularity. And when those patterns were matched against domestic cash movements, the outline of an international laundering highway began to appear. Cash arriving abroad didn't always physically move further. Much like underground banking systems elsewhere, value was balanced rather than transported. Money collected in London could result in payouts elsewhere without ever leaving the city. This reduced risk and increased efficiency. Borders remained technically compliant. Balances quietly shifted. Internally, records were meticulous. Not because the gang planned to explain them, but because control required clarity. Ledgers tracked volumes, routes, and partners. These records never touched official systems, but they governed the operation with precision. Mistakes were rare, not because people were perfect, but because systems made deviation difficult. This level of organization allowed the empire to function across years, not months. Many criminal networks collapse under the weight of internal mistrust or greed. This one avoided both,
By focusing on process instead of personality, roles were defined, authority flowed smoothly, disputes were handled quietly. Everything was designed to avoid disruption. But scale has consequences. As volumes increased, flexibility decreased. The more money that flowed through certain routes, the harder it became to disguise repetition. Front businesses began to show financial anomalies. Travel histories grew longer. Even the best camouflage can stretch thin when used too often. Law enforcement understood that confronting the gang head-on would be ineffective. Instead, they traced money backward. Each cash run suggested another. Each unexplained transaction hinted at many more beneath it. Slowly, the empire that believed itself invisible began to cast a long financial shadow. Collaboration became key. Agencies compared notes, timings, and flows. What one department saw as suspicious banking behavior, another matched with travel data. Alone, these details meant little. Together, they painted a picture of an operation functioning at industrial scale. The gang responded, as it always had, by adjusting the system rather than panicking. Routes shifted, couriers were replaced, activity paused in one area and resumed in another. From inside the network, it likely felt controlled. From the outside, however, those adjustments confirmed that someone was trying to stay ahead of observation. Each adjustment made the structure tighter, not looser, and tight structures, once identified, are easier to monitor. The empire that once thrived on flexibility was slowly boxing itself into predictable reactions. By now, authorities weren't just observing money, they were observing response. How the network behaved under pressure told just as much as how it operated at rest. Suspicion was no longer theoretical, it was active. The cash pipeline still flowed, but it was no longer free. Each movement was now part of a larger story being assembled piece by piece. And as that story grew clearer, it became obvious that the gang's greatest strength, organization, would also be the reason they could no longer disappear. Because when money moves with this much order, it leaves a trail. And once that trail is understood, the final chapter stops being a mystery and becomes a matter of timing.
That timing arrived quietly, without sirens or spectacle. Investigations of this scale rarely end with a dramatic moment. They end with coordination. Agencies had spent years observing, mapping, and waiting, not for a single mistake, but for certainty. By the time decisive action was taken, the outcome was already mathematically inevitable. The network had been understood well enough that removing key pieces would cause everything else to stall. The National Crime Agency approached the takedown the same way the gang had approached its operation, systematically. Rather than targeting low-level players first, investigators focused on structure. They identified pressure points, people and businesses that connected multiple strands of the network. Once those were mapped, the rest of the system became vulnerable by design. Surveillance gave way to synchronization. Properties linked to laundering, transport, and coordination were observed simultaneously. Travel patterns were monitored closely. Financial movements were cross-checked against operational intelligence. By the time warrants were executed, authorities already knew what they were going to find. The goal wasn't discovery, it was confirmation. When raids finally happened, they exposed a reality far different from the myth of shadowy criminal fortresses. Evidence was found in everyday places: homes, offices, vehicles that looked no different from thousands of others. Records were discovered not hidden behind elaborate concealment, but stored where the operation needed them regularly. The gang had relied on invisibility, not secrecy. Once visibility was forced, protection vanished. Cash, documents, devices, and business records told a consistent story, not of chaos or improvisation, but of method. Financial logs lined up with movement histories. Business accounts matched laundering routes. Travel records reinforced timelines investigators had already built independently. The network didn't collapse under questioning, it collapsed under its own documentation. What followed was a slow unraveling rather than an explosion. Arrests didn't trigger panic. Communications stopped exactly as the system had been designed to do under threat. But silence cuts both ways. Without coordination, sub-operations froze. Couriers waited. Businesses stalled. Routes went unused. Within days, the empire stopped functioning. In court, what stood out wasn't just the scale of the crimes, but their nature. There was no reliance on spontaneous wrongdoing or uncontrolled risk.
This was criminality built on management principles: delegation, compartmentalization, auditing, and risk mitigation. It blurred the line between legitimate enterprise and organized crime, forcing the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some of the most harmful crimes don't look violent or dramatic from the inside. The case exposed how modern organized crime adapts to its environment. In a world of cameras, regulations, and digital oversight, it abandoned loud methods and embraced systems that imitate legal commerce. The gang didn't fight the system, it hid inside it. That made detection harder and consequences wider. For victims, especially those trafficked through this machinery, the takedown didn't undo what had already happened, but it did interrupt a pipeline that treated human lives as commodities. The end of the network meant an end to repeat exploitation, an outcome measured not in headlines, but in absence. Fewer routes, fewer journeys, fewer people disappearing into transport systems designed to erase them. For law enforcement, the case became a template. It proved that patience, collaboration, and system-level analysis could succeed against operations built to avoid attention. Rather than chasing symptoms, they neutralized structure. Rather than reacting, they waited until the network revealed itself through consistency. And for the gang itself, the downfall wasn't dramatic. It was structural. The same order that made the operation effective made it legible once seen clearly. Once authorities understood how money, transport, and people move together, the illusion of invisibility collapsed. Perhaps most unsettling was how easily it had all blended into daily life. The streets hadn't changed, businesses hadn't looked suspicious, vehicles hadn't stood out. The empire hadn't felt like a threat because it hadn't demanded attention. It had depended on being ignored. In the aftermath, London returned to routine. Properties released again, traffic flowed as usual. To the city, it was just another case closed. But beneath that normality, something had shifted. The investigation exposed how absence of visible harm doesn't equal absence of harm, and how systems designed for efficiency can be repurposed for exploitation if left unchecked. This wasn't a story about a single gang. It was a story about how modern crime evolves alongside modern society. It showed that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it integrates, exports, balances books, and files paperwork. And it left behind a reminder that remains quietly relevant. When crime hides in plain sight, the answer isn't louder enforcement, it's deeper observation. Because the most powerful criminal empires aren't those that terrorize through fear. They're the ones that convince the world they don't exist at all.